welcome to Nacht, Waffen Pilot with Penny Bradley. Today's guest is Andrew D. Basiago, and he is the American lawyer, writer, public speaker, media personality, and presidential candidate best known for serving as a U.S. chrononaut in Project Pegasus during the advent of time travel, and in Project Mars during the advent of interdimensional travel. Welcome, Andy.
Good to be with you, Penny.
Well, we've tried a couple of times. We're finally getting an audio file recorded. Yay!
Yes.
Yes.
All things in due time.
All things in due time. Both of us are not as young as we used to be and have health issues. So for the public who is sitting there thinking that we're doing this in a recording studio somewhere, not. He's on a phone, I'm in my living room, there's traffic driving by, and my partner who lives with me, that y'all know as Lou, keeps going in and out. And to make things even more interesting, the landlady has a carpet guy next door who will occasionally be hammering. So, welcome to reality. I finally got you on air. So, let's talk about...
Here we are. So
do you want to talk about Project Pegasus first or Mars first?
I'd like to do Pegasus first, because I was in it. I stopped being in it 50 years ago this year. I was in it roughly from 1967, 68, when I was age 6, to 1972 when I was 11, and then we moved to California. And I didn't get back into government service until 1980 when I was an undergraduate at UCLA. So it always makes more sense to cover Pegasus first. There's been a lot of confusion as if they were the same program, and they weren't. Pegasus was under DARPA,
Just a minute.
Project Mars was under, essentially, the DoD in general. So it's my position that they were not the same program, although some of my fellow Mars astronauts like Bernie Mendez believes they were, and that Mars was just a continuation of Pegasus. And in a sense it was, because the aeronautical repositioning chambers, or jump rooms, or space elevator, if you were, that we were using to get to the red planet, was another quantum access device.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, that's why I've stopped calling myself, and a U.S. astronaut during the advent of interplanetary exploration, because really there's no question that the ARC was an interdimensional, quantum access-based way of getting to places beyond our planet. And I think that they were always asking us so many questions when we got back from Mars, or what they believed was probably Mars, to determine whether that particular quantum access device was getting us to the Mars that we see in the night sky sometimes, or some other planetoid in the multiverse, if you will.
Yeah, I
think
get
two different
that.
Programs.
I was taken to what I was told was Mars in 1964. I did not go from Los Angeles. I went from New York, and which is really interesting because I grew my here and now life. I grew up in California. But yeah, I went through the jump gate that's on Long Island, and same time frame, and presumably the same place that we went, because we were both told it was Mars.
Well, there were certainly both old, urban structures there, like the site that I call the dilapidated brick city.
Mm-hmm.
I always have to walk through that to bring this data disk to an American technician working inside one of those essentially broken down brick buildings. But there were also 7 or 8 receiving what we would call jump rooms, but they were really the facilities that facilitated the arrival of the the jump room or arc or space elevator, if you will. And some of those were clearly quite old. They could have dated for as much from, let's say, the early 60s or the 50s as some of the dilapidated brick cities could have been from the time of Edgar Rice Burroughs. I mean, they were very old areas. I mean, that dilapidated brick city had small little brown bricks, and the only place I've been in America with such architecture was the colonial district of Philadelphia. So
Okay.
I don't know when the U.S. presence began on the Red Planet, although they did tell us that it began in 1964 with two American astronauts who went up there via rocket and crashed on the surface and had negotiated to be rescued by one of the Martian humanoid populations, who then reneged and they died of exposure on the surface. That was in a stack of about 4-inch thick worth of documents from the French External Intelligence Organization that Regina E. Dugan and Barry Soetoro, later known as Barack Obama, and I went through in early September of 1980 when we were in training. They jumped us from like August or September back to June of that year via teleportation. We were sequestered in the dorm rooms at College of the Siskiyous for several months to write our theses about the Martian humanoid civilization for the CIA's threat assessment of that civilization on Mars. We had three options. We could say that the Martian humanoids presented a danger to we on Earth, did not, or it could not be determined. And I think the way that played out among the three of us is I determined that there was no evidence to assume that the Martians represented any threat to us, in my threat assessment, my thesis rather. Regina Dugan said very much there was, because, for example, their unwillingness to rescue our downed astronauts, fating them to their deaths on the surface. And I think the one who ended up president first, or at all, Barack Obama, probably said it could not be determined. That would have been the politic thesis for me to have chosen, but I had to adhere to the truth because that's been my style, as it were.
Yeah,
So
that's
anyway,
that's been my style too, is to adhere to the truth as I know it.
When I was 18 years old, that's what I saw in those French intelligence documents, but beyond that, we were never briefed in the program of when the American presence began there. And then when we started going there were some pretty old jump rooms. Like one said, "Welcome to Mars." And it looked
In
really
English?
like a kind of a, yes.
Because the one that I went through, it was in German.
I want to talk to you about that, Penny, and I was most eager to do a show with you to discuss that. I'd like you to give your ideas to me as to why I was never briefed on a German presence, I never met any Germans on the surface, and I never met any evidence of a historical German presence on the Red Planet, like insignia of Prussian eagles or Nazi swastikas or modern German flags. What was your understanding of how the U.S. and the German presence there was being sort of segregated? So I think they kept us away from it.
I think
Because I have
that
no data on what I call Germania.
we were kept completely separated. Later on, when I was a fighter pilot, I would be assigned to do air cover for American military. And at that point, I was told, these people are going to be here, you need to give them air support, you do not interact with them. And we were kept completely separated from each other. I never interacted with Americans there at all. other than the ones that I came there with. I came with a group of about 20 of us. I can't remember exactly how many. And we were separated into two dorms. And the Germans put us into Schule, and I was in Schule for 10 years before I was put in a plane. And then I served for 15 years before I got in trouble and then sent into the German space military. But it
One thing I
wasn't.
was thinking about why I can't discount the German presence is, I think it was Rumsfeld who said, we know what we know what we don't know, but we don't know what we don't know. One thing I have correlated that I think may explain this sort of forced separation, because, by the way, we're only crossed once diagonally by a team of about 10 Soviet Russians, but we would meet Britons as well as fellow Americans on the surface and have pretty extended discussions with them, like right amidst them, But one thing I thought about that may explain this sort of keeping the different factions on Mars apart is one time Courtney Ann Hunt of the CIA and I walked about, I don't know, about 100 feet from one of the jump rooms, and we hit like a force field that we couldn't get past. Another time he had not he, but I guess it was Bernie Mendez, had Barry Soetoro, who of course would later become Barack Obama, fire a flare up towards the sky, and it hit something and kind of skittled along some kind of dome that was obviously up there containing the sky or blocking the sky. So I know that there were limits that were put in place that I do know was there. And so because we don't know how extensive that system was of blocking some astronauts from going to certain areas of the planet, for all we know, that may explain why I never ran into any Germans up there. Maybe they had some agreement to keep those factions apart for historical reasons or scientific reasons, who knows. But I just have to be upfront about the fact that I've tended to resist the stories of a German presence in the Red Planet because I simply wasn't trained in it. I didn't meet it. I didn't see any evidence of any regalia of a German nature, any accents, any insignia, any mention of them by anybody else. But I was running into some fairly prominent Americans on the surface. I was just telling Dr. Sala about meeting Admiral Stansfield Turner on the surface. I thought it was the Bigfoot hunter, Peter Byrne, when he walked towards Bernie Mendez and I, because he was dressed kind of in a safari suit, with a fancy hat and a cravat and a khaki suit. And he comes up to us and goes, hi, fellas, Stan Turner. So it wasn't Peter Byrne, it was Stansfield Turner. And then another time, actually a couple of times, I had conversations with Ross Perot Sr. on the surface. So what I've pieced together is that a lot of the American presence on the surface was Navy. I was listed with the Naval Investigative Service in Upland, California, while having a lieutenant commander alias with the Navy under a different name. Bernie Mendez was with the DOD, but Courtney Hunt of the CIA said to me that he reached the admiral level in the Naval Secret Service. William Cameron McCool, who went on sadly to die aboard Space Shuttle Columbia on February 1st of 2003, was one of my fellow astronauts there. We were trained with Willie McCool. But also, of course, Ross Perot and Stansfield Turner were, like Willie McCool, Annapolis graduates, Navy Academy graduates. So there was clearly a very widespread naval presence.
Well, when I was there,
on the American contingent.
When I was there, those of us who were American were put into blues instead of the browns and oranges that the Germans wore. And we were told that we were U.S. Navy on loan to them. So I was officially the equivalent of what would be a second lieutenant, but since the Navy doesn't have a second lieutenant, they considered me a first, you know, just in German it would be Leutnant. And that was the minimum position that I could have to be a pilot. So I had no military training on Earth. I had been trained at Langley to be a psi weapon.
Yeah.
So in some ways my service on Mars was a waste of my abilities, but in other ways it was a great education before going into their space military.
Yeah. It was really so far out that when we look back on it, it's kind of like, I kind of view it as sort of an extended, de minimis nightmare. I mean, it was so stressful, so challenging.
I grew up there.
I did it? Yeah, yeah.
I grew up there first, so that's home to me. And that's something that a lot of people here on Earth just don't get, is I grew up with those people. When I graduated from Langley and was sent to Mars, 5 years of sheer hell stopped, and I was suddenly just a kid for 10 years. And that was, when you've been put through rape and mind fracture and weaponization of psi abilities and programs that make Stranger Things look like a walk in the park, and then you're suddenly in a position where you're just a kid learning to read and write and do math and science. That's almost like going to heaven. And so in some ways, once my memories were back, part of me wants to go back. And that's
I don't miss it. Yeah.
That's a big difference between those of us who served with the Germans and those of us who served with the Americans. Is the Americans remember Mars as hell, where we remember Mars as someplace that the torture stopped. So it's a very different approach. When we saw that sign, Willkommen in Mars, it was, the lady on the other side was cranky. And we were assigned to barracks, not a family. But we were sent to school like kids.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I was going up there from age 19 to 22 between July of 1981 and August of 1984. What is that?
Okay.
37 months.
I was
still a young adult. Some of my colleagues were teenagers per se.
I was there.
14 when we went up.
I was 9 when I was sent to Mars, and that was in 1964. And I was sent off Mars in 1990. So I spent a great deal of time there. I was there for most of the war. But I wasn't a foot soldier. I was in a ship. I was flying over it and dropping bombs on the life forms that we were fighting. We were fighting an insectoid race that really resembles ants, and a reptilian race that really resembles raptors from the movies. And
now, was the reptoid bipedal?
Yes, they were bipedal. They had.
Oh yeah, I had contact with 2 of those. In fact, I saw one bite like a 45-year-old male colleague named Bob in half from a distance of about 30 feet. And I saw another one, a smaller one, bite a 16-year-old blonde kid from California named David to death on the stomach. Both of those were quite difficult to witness.
I've witnessed
Fortunately, I
people.
wasn't trapped by one of those reptoids.
I have witnessed people shredded by their claws.
Mhm.
Single swipe and you're gutted. Yeah.
Yeah, they were quite deadly. We were taught to run in zigzag patterns if they ever trapped us, got so close to us that we wouldn't be able to evade them, with a view to boring them, making them lose interest in chasing us, and then we'd be able to run free. But that seldom worked.
They're an intelligent, formerly spacefaring race. There's no way to bore them into losing interest. If they've decided that they're going to capture or kill you, you're gone. We were
close to them, but fortunately I was never. The first one, after he killed Bob, he looked over at Courtney Hunt and I, who were on his left, and he stared at us, and it's like, I saw myself staring into this big evil eye, that I wish I could get out of my mind, but it was quite perilous. I kind of had a single pointed attention as I was looking back at him, talking in my mind, nice dinosaur, nice dinosaur, nice dinosaur. And fortunately, he just turned around and scampered off.
They're a telepathic race. They used to have space flight. The inner Earth raptors are a branch of the same species, left over from when they were a spacefaring race. And they are basically in a dark age where they've reverted to tribal behaviors. But they still have that biological intelligence, and they're formidable. If it's a unarmed human and one of them, they're going to win every time.
Now, when you say below ground, do you mean on Earth? On Earth?
Yeah, on Earth. So yeah, we were in the German group. We were taught, do not engage. If you cannot avoid engagement, to simply not resist. That was the only hope you had of not being killed, was to not resist, to let them into your mind, let them see everything.
I was given a little cyanide capsule in a plastic bag that I kept in my pocket to check out if I ever got captured by them, if I wanted to. So.
Yeah, we weren't given that option. There were too few of us and we were in a war, so we were supposed to try to survive. But if we were captured by either the insectoids or the reptoids, we were supposed to simply not resist.
Now, Penny, when I asked Courtney Hunt, why do you want me to go? Because they trained me in 1980, and then Courtney's cover for CIA was an Exxon station at the intersection of Mason and Devonshire in Chatsworth, California, where my family was living, really from 1972 forward. So I've been living there like 8-9 years, and it was the next summer, 81, when I went back to work at that gas station, and Hunt was used as basically my second Mars training officer after Major Ed Dames in summer of 80. And he said, look, do you want to go to Mars? And I said, well, I never wanted to be an astronaut. Tell me, why do I have to go to Mars? And I'm absolutely certain, he said, because the survival of the human race on Earth depends on it. And I'm sure he didn't mean just by me going. I think he might have even added, we need young people like yourself to take this bid and go to the Red Planet. Now, what would be the explanation for Hunt's comments vis-a-vis the presence of the reptoids both on the surface of the Red Planet and below surface of this planet, below ground on Earth? What were they afraid of? Was it a reptoid resurgence on Earth that would be initiated on Mars? Or what were they trying to achieve vis-a-vis the reptoids on Mars? Just to destroy all of them?
Their plan is to exterminate them so that when we go into a phase where we are in our dark age, that they won't exterminate all of us. Now, that's a typical military stance, but at the same time, what's going on is Earth goes through a phase every few thousand years where stuff happens on the surface. The Okay, I'm trying to put this in language my audience understands. There is a slippage of the crust that looks very similar to a pole flip but isn't exactly. And we end up with the actual poles migrating. And if you look through the alignment of certain ancient buildings, you'll find where the actual pole, North Pole, has shifted toward away from England and towards Russia. It's currently somewhere in Western Canada, but it's heading towards Russia. And this slippage is 500 years overdue. And the American government got this information from, I believe it was the Zeta Reticuli. And it's available on the CIA archive website. The file is called The Adam and Eve Story. Now, I have my doubts about it, but at the same time, the CIA is taking it very seriously. And so they are moving the best and the brightest of our young people to Mars, hoping to survive as a civilization there while this slippage occurs here. At least there's a
lecture in.
At least there's a document. Large parts of it are redacted still, but at least there's a document.
Right. I was saying I know I had a 3-day lecture on essentially sort of a coming global superstorm type of scenario involving global cooling when I was on Project Pegasus. That was in 1971 or 72.
Yeah, I remember.
Along the lines of like Robert Felix's Ice Age premises and let's say Al Gore's global warming.
I remember that in the 70s that it was the Ice Age was coming, and then when Al Gore came, it was, global warming is here, and now they're just calling it climate change. And I'm seeing extremes rather than one way or the other. But at the same time, this story about slippage is very concerning to me because from the file, it sounds like it starts with either Yellowstone in Montana, Wyoming, or it starts with the Long Valley caldera on the eastern side of the Sierras here in California. Now, I live in the Sierras, so that's pretty close to home.
Well, I think it was between 1960 and 70, they moved a third of the American people west of the Mississippi River. I think in 1960, 2/3 of the population was east of the Mississippi. And then by 1970, could have been perhaps 1980, they had moved 2/3 of the population west of the Mississippi. So my reading of that was that that was responsive to the Ice Age theories that the CIA had in the 70s, the late 60s and early 70s, in which they were expecting to lose New England and the northern states to glaciation. We know that during the last ice age, the glaciers came down to the southern Kansas border. So they seem to have a desire to move, for example, engineering companies like my dad's employer, the Ralph M. Parsons Company, the world's largest process engineering company, then and now, from New York City to Los Angeles and so forth. That was going on all over the place in the late 60s, early 70s, so that the junior high and high school I went to in Chatsworth, Lawrence and then Chatsworth High, every other kid's father was like an engineer or a technical writer for the Defense Department. So there's definitely a major cultural shift that was going on, let's say in the early 70s there, before I even went to Mars, in which we were moving personnel south by southwest. And that I think was responsive to more of an ice age type of concern or some kind of planetary shift. But by the way, if there was a new polar center moving from Western Canada over to Russia, what would be the favorable part of the United States within our own ability to move places?
The favorable part of the United States would be the Pacific Northwest, except that if you start this cycle of volcanic activity, the Pacific Northwest is covered with volcanoes, and we have proof in the flows that cover east of there for hundreds of miles that in the past they've been an issue. So other than the volcanoes, the Pacific Northwest would be the place to go. Now, my reading of the Adam and Eve files, there will be parts of California that will remain as islands, and I live on one of those. But the best places for that scenario are the eastern side of the Rockies, the Alleghenies south of Virginia, the Ozarks, the hillbilly areas. Those are going to be the safest places, because if their scenario is right, all of the coastal cities of California are going to slip and slide. Now, that fault, the San Andreas, is a sideways fault. It's not an up and down fault. So I have serious issues with that part of the scenario, because side slip faults do not just suddenly succumb underneath everything. Now, if they were going to go with the faults that are down the center of the Great Valley, at that point they have an issue. Or even the faults on the eastern side of the Sierras, those are up and down faults. But the one on the coast that they're claiming is what's going to happen, it's not physically possible. And so I keep looking at this and going, if they're talking about the San Andreas that Interstate 5 basically follows, then that's not possible, because it's a sideways where the western part of the landmass is moving north and the eastern part is moving south. So, the way that fault is operating, you're going to have Baja in where Santa Barbara is in the next million years. But if you're looking farther east, there is a slip fault where the eastern Sierras are rising along a fault face, but it forms like when you only raise one side of a plate, the other side goes down. You have that in the middle of the valley, and right now you can't see it because it's covered with sand from rivers. You know, the alluvial fill is disguising it, but that one underneath the valley, that one could very well do exactly what they're describing. They've just got it. They've just got it 100 miles west of where it would really happen. Um, my background. I studied geology. I studied chemistry. I studied physics. I was pre-med microbiology at San Diego State in 1980 to 1982. So, yeah, I do have some background to talk about this. So, yeah, a lot of people think that because I talked about that I served with the Germans that I don't have any background, but yeah, I was pre-med microbiology and I took all of these science courses to do that. And then I was diagnosed with lupus. So, since I'm retired from being disabled, I have all this time to research.
Well, there's always a blessing, right? Silver
Oh, yeah.
lining to every cloud.
Yeah, the silver lining is that I have time to check out the CIA archive and find the files that they're talking about and go through them and compare them to the actual science and see what's real and what isn't. And that's something that I don't see a lot of people doing, mostly because they have to work for a living and they don't have time to do it.
Right. I think there's also a question of time domains that goes unexplored. Right. I know, for example, Ivan C. Browning, Dr. Browning, was one of the federal scientists that I met very frequently on Pegasus. In fact, when we met a young Bill Clinton shortly after he'd been informed of his future presidency, the only other people at the table, in addition to myself and my father, were Dr. Harold M. Agnew, the director of the program, Joe Conason of Parsons, and Dr. Ivan, I think it was Ivan C. Browning.
Okay.
And Ivan was always talking about the Madrid fault, but he was always thinking of or encouraging the idea of moving to New Mexico. And then he determined that within a relevant time domain relative to our survival or our lifetimes, it would make more sense to go to places with fresh drinking water and enough water at all. Because drought was going to be the real issue. So he moved to Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. And my source on that was his daughter, Evelyn Browning Garris, who I spoke with for several hours about 10 years ago. So, you know, Ivan was director of science and technology for CIA from 1959 to 74, right during this period of ice age studies and, you know, global, you know, polar magnetic shift speculation. So I think that's what he concluded, that it would be better to go to Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, because of the deep, fresh lakes, you know, freshwater lakes.
Well, that makes sense.
Have enough drinking water than to go to New Mexico just to avoid an ice age.
Well, at the same point, it's the same Pacific Northwest territory that I talked about it, but it's sitting right smack between all of the volcanic regions. My uncle used to work for the Geological Survey, and he was stationed out of Challis, Idaho for years. He was a cartographer.
Well, I spent about 6 months living up in Sun Valley, Idaho in 2013, 2014. And I was amazed at the degree to which the Sun Valley community is survivalist. They definitely think they're going to be able to sort of pinch off that that valley and protect themselves from, marauders fleeing geological disasters or military incursions or something. There's a real underground of survivalism in Sun Valley. I'm talking Haley, Ketchum, Sun Valley.
There's that element here too. We have two different militia groups here that are both survivalist. They're different religious backgrounds, but other than that, they're basically identical. One claims Christianity, the other claims Satanism, but to look at them on the street, you couldn't tell them apart. They're both wearing military camos and armed to the teeth. And the police step aside for them. But yeah, there are parts of California that are just as conservative and redneck as any place in the Deep South or in the states like Idaho. So, and a lot of the country doesn't realize that because all they hear about are the coastal cities. So, it is what it is. We're all doing what we can to survive it the best we know how. So, when you were on Mars, you talked about critters that I don't remember. So,
well, there was, in addition to the reptoids that you described as bipedal, which I think is an important distinction that I've made as well, but that in his mystification, his confabulation, let's say, Randy Kramer missed, and was claiming that they were not, that the insectivoids were also bipedal. The insectivoids we had contact with had multiple appendages. I would estimate 10 to 12. They looked like big multi-appendage grasshoppers with saber teeth about the size of a small garbage truck. And they could just absolutely slice somebody up. That's one that William B. Stillings and I ran from for about a mile until we were utterly exhausted.
well, I was in a
So that
plane,
was the
but
other inevitable lethal predator on the surface.
I don't remember the grasshopper ones, and I do remember the ants. I remember the ground basically crawling with small insects and reptiles.
Also snakes. There were a lot of snakes on the surface.
Absolutely.
I was worried about falling on one and getting bitten.
Yeah, snakes, lizards. What I have the most nightmares about are the spiders. And the spiders would hatch out, they'd be the size of your hand. But by the time I encountered them, they would be from 6 feet across to 15 feet across. And they were nasty. I hope you never encountered one.
I can't discount that being covered by dames in our biological briefings, but I fortunately was able to evade that. And I think that also, you think of the ostensible fragility of a spider regardless of its size because of its distribution of mass and surface area and so forth and its long legs. I think that was probably determined by biome and what latitude you were at. Now, were you in the middle latitudes between the equatorial and the polar, or were you more primarily deployed to the equatorial or conversely the polar regions? Because I was never in those regions, just the middle latitudes.
I was normally flying over the northern mid-range to polar regions.
right? Well, that would explain the different animals that we encountered, because I was simply never in the polar regions.
Now, I know you know of Doris Neely. She
Yes.
She is a retired CIA archivist, and she graced me with several interviews where we went over my testimony versus what she had uploaded about me. And she mentioned several critters that I have no actual memory of. And I asked her about your grasshoppers because I didn't remember them, and she said, "Oh yeah, they're real." And she was frustrated because she said most of my report from Mars was about the flies there, and I frankly don't remember them at all. So,
And by the way, she did also confirm my veracity based on government records, just as she confirmed yours.
yeah,
So I think that
I knew
between
she had.
you and I, Penny, we can confirm that Doris Neely of the CIA confirmed that both of us were in government files that she had access to.
And I have seen the documents where she sued the CIA for racial discrimination, and it went to the Supreme Court, and she was given permission to sue them, and that verifies that she did indeed work for them. So I've had people question that. So yeah, she sued the CIA, which is proof that she worked for them. And those documents are public record.
To the extent that her lawsuit was not thrown out of court as frivolous or failure to state a claim under 12b1 or 12b6 of the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure, that's tantamount to an admission by the government that her claims were valid because she worked for them. So you have it.
So, yeah, she verified both of us. My group of Montauk survivors that I had a roundtable with last Memorial Day weekend, she verified that she had files on all of them as well. So there are close to a dozen of us now that she verified, and I'm really grateful that she did, because we had no other way of having any kind of proof the way that the CIA has classified us.
Right, and after I confirmed that I was told by Courtney Hunt of the CIA to transfer from UCLA to Columbia University so as to enter in fall of 1981, and my colleague Barry Soetoro, who later changed his name to Barack Obama, by 1983, and even I encountered him even back then in summer of 1983 when he was using the name Barack Obama. She confirmed Obama's presence at the CIA in kind of a State Department lesson plan. In other words, he was being specifically sort of introduced to liaison between CIA and state. And I remember that when I was in training in summer of 80, he showed me readings he was getting for the presidency, including, I think it was the U.S. Supreme Court under the American Constitutional System or something of that nature, by Professor Lawrence Tribe of the very law school he would then go on to attend 8 years later, Harvard Law School. So
yeah, I knew he was at Harvard. I knew he was at Harvard Law School.
Well, she's a major insider as to confirming both your service on Mars, my own, and the fact that when we raised the issue of President Obama being one of our fellow astronauts in Project Mars, it was not an attempt to attack him. It was not based on any particular hostility towards him or a black president or black people or any irrelevant issue. It was based on the fact that he served with us and he was president, and he was making a joke of it because I guess he didn't want to be tied to CIA. but we have Doris Neely of the CIA to thank for confirming your service on Mars, mine, and the fact that the President Obama card that we played, those of us in the Truth Movement regarding our service on the Red Planet, were simply identifying everybody up there. We didn't just talk about Barry, as we would call President Obama, because that's how I identified himself, as Barry Sotoro of Indonesia. It wasn't part of the so-called birther controversy. We were identifying everybody who had served, like Regina Dugan, who President Obama appointed the 19th and first female director of DARPA on July 20th of 2009. William Cameron McCool of the Space Shuttle program, and so forth. And
all
yet
of the
it
people
got spun by the mainstream media into the Obama on Mars story. And that also horrified us as an utter irrelevancy and inaccuracy.
I didn't know the people that were on the American side. I know faces from some of the people that were on the German side. And the ones that I remember didn't work for the CIA, they ended up working for the NSA. And that's a distinction I think should probably be out there, something that I haven't mentioned before. And it was the NSA who activated my memories. So I've been shot at repeatedly with energy weapons, and to be honest, I really don't know exactly who's doing it, but I don't know who would have a motive after the government itself activated me. Why would they be shooting me for talking? I mean, it makes no sense.
Well, Penny, I would explain that to factionalism within the intel community and military, because when I came forward on a lecture basis in 2004 in Portland, Oregon, while practicing law here in Washington State, Virginia Olds of the CIA, who I had met when I was a child on Pegasus, told me that because I was speaking clearly and I was telling accurately what happened, and I wasn't engaging in the post-Vietnam syndrome of always faulting the government as a bunch of malefactors of one sort or another, they were going to let me go forward. But that was only several years after a representative of the executive office of President George W. Bush had told me that if I didn't stop investigating, writing about, or talking about the time travel devices I was exposed to in Project Pegasus, which remained sensitive, compartmentalized national security secrets, the Bush administration, couldn't guarantee my survival. So the implication was that it was either a warning or a threat, but at the same time, I can't discount the possibility that they were literally reporting to me, they were briefing me on the fact that some other faction would attack me for talking about these time travel devices. So that could be a breakaway civilization. It could be a foreign power. I don't know, but I do know that when I ran for president in 2016 and was directing my campaign, pardon me, from Charlotte, North Carolina, and then when I went back to Washington State, I did have experiences that very well could have been directed energy weapons being directed at me on the street level. I just don't know if what I saw, I thought I saw, but after the initial event in March of 2016, by April of that year, my retinas were bleeding. And that gradually led to such serious vision loss by 2018 that I had to have 6 operations on my eyes in 2019.
Yeah, I remember you had those. I remember you had to have those surgeries. I don't know if you knew I contributed towards your fund or not, but
I do remember that. Thank you.
It was something that those of us in the community who care about the truth should have contributed. That's how I felt about it.
Well, I adhere to Mark Passio's view of natural law, That which is good will adhere to our positive karma. That which is evil will adhere to our negative karma. So you've been blessed just for doing that, and I thank you for doing that, for you and I.
Thank you. I've listened to a lot of Mark Passio's work. I find him relevant. I would really love to have him on my show if he decides to join me.
I think he would, knowing that the intellectual caliber of both of you. I think that that would be a fruitful discussion.
I've had a tutor for some time who was born into an Illuminati family, and he has been teaching me the way things really are here. And I reached a point about a year ago that he decided that I was his equal. So that was a shock. He put on his Facebook wall that I was family, and that mattered to me. Whenever someone has taken the effort to teach you and then they decide to let the world know that you made the grade, that matters. So, but yeah, I grew up in one of those families where women were supposed to take care of the house and the kids and not know anything, so it was very different from my experiences in the programs. And I had a very difficult time doing that, and still do. Seen and not heard is not my style. So.
Well, what I've been alienated by, and I think it probably led to my decision to come forward and tell the truth about these programs, is the disruption and the creation of disbelief among family members, old friends, and members of the general public. I don't think that those of us who were brought into special access programs in childhood were ever subjected to any social equity in terms of what they promised, in terms of paying us, our military decorations, and so forth. I mean, I went on to earn 5 post-secondary degrees because they had worked so extensively with me in childhood as a whiz kid to give me specialized education.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I had such knowledge in my head that during the college quiz bowl, the questioner said centuries before myth, and before being able to complete the question centuries before Nicholas Copernicus developed his heliocentric theory of the universe, this Greek philosopher did. And he just said centuries before myth. I chimed in and said, who was Aristarchus of Samos? So I have stuff up inside my mind that made me inevitably a lifelong scholar. I still am. I mean, on a weekend, I'll sit at our dining room table and listen to Siri and ask questions about certain nutrients and stuff of Siri, and make these lists of what I should be eating and so forth. I've never really stopped learning.
I'm glad
you use us then for special access programs.
I am very glad you found a way around your vision problems. That makes me really happy. Because
I can make very large letters with Sharpies, but I can still not read very well.
If I were in the position that you've been in since your surgeries, I would be just going absolutely crazy.
I kind of am. I'm now going to figure out what to do during Dallas. I think I'm going to study foreign languages. I've always wanted to master Spanish, for example, and possibly even French. So I may be doing that. I'm thinking about, listening to books by my favorite authors, favorite novelists and historians on Audible, if I can figure a way to pipe that into me at my Dallas clinic. But
that would be cool.
I really believe in using our time, but what I think was officious and offensive about these special access programs was a couple things. One was creating all these specialized teams with all this incredible intrigue, horror, talent, and original experience, really, really valuable, rare life experience. But they didn't realize the degree of alienation from those in our family or among our lifelong friends who simply wouldn't believe what we were talking about because we didn't share it when we were in it. Well, of course we didn't share it when we were in it. It was top secret.
Yeah.
You know, you don't go around blabbing about things that would jeopardize operational security, project secrecy. So I think that our military and our intel community were lacking a certain capacious measure of how people brought into these special access programs were going to cope with the alienation from the disbelief that it's just completely unfair. And I mean, I had statements from people at the CIA like Courtney Hunt saying, look, I can tell my next door neighbor that I work for the CIA and I'm not going to believe it.
Yeah.
But
You can tell people you did anything that looks out of the ordinary and they are simply not going to believe you.
you know, I had already arrived when I came forward on both Project Pegasus and Project Mars. I had written for Jacques Cousteau. I had been a protege in college with Norman's cousins at UCLA. I had published environmental policy papers at the international peer review level. I had been admitted to the Washington Bar and then later the U.S. District Court for the Western District of Washington. And people never sit back and, you know, Richard Hogan was saying I was a non-person, I was a legend scripted by the CIA, when all of my academic and law-related records were right there on the internet, unlike most people.
Yeah.
So, you know, I've been alienated by this sort of convenient pattern of disbelief by most Americans, not to me personally, but really to everybody who's talking about the special access program and what we've actually done as a civilization, because I think it also feeds in to the evasion of the American and federal governmental responsibility to do things like finally pay us. I think it's a very kind of convenient adherence to disbelief. And,
Well, I think the pay issue has to do with deniability. There were crimes involved for most of us. I was kidnapped out of my bed when I was 4. That's still a federal felony. I was mind fractured through sexual abuse. That's still a federal felony. I was weaponized. My psi abilities were weaponized. That's
as well as mine, yes.
And that's still a felony. So the people involved don't want to be charged with these crimes, and if they pay us, it acknowledges that we were there and generally telling the truth.
Yes. And so I found, you may have encountered this term, I encountered it rather recently, despite all these years of truth telling, and that is that within the intelligence, this pattern of pushing people off deck and denying that they even served or that their programs existed, and they're not paid, that's known as a ghost. And I want to see a U.S. Senator stand up on his or her hind legs and get rid of this ghosting. This is fundamentally un-American and unconstitutional to have used people in this way and then just cheated them of everything that they and usually the father, but whatever parent or parents decided to allow them to participate in these programs were told. They were lying to everybody as a standard operating procedure. I even found out from Dr. Jean Maria Arrigo of California, a UC San Diego educated social psychologist, that in the intel community, that 20% who are doing things operationally are known as operators. The other 80% are analysts. But the people they exploit, frequently young people, even very young children, to accomplish certain missions, are known as operatives. And operatives are never affirmed, they're never paid, and they're constantly abused and lied to.
Mm-hmm.
So in that sense, the CIA is an evil organization. And I've studied what its actual substrates may have been. Courtney Hunt said it was actually the Vatican, that the company was originally the company of Jesus, in other words, the Jesuits, and that the Catholic confessional, for example, was the beginning of collecting intelligence data on everyday citizens. I
Now
don't know whether that's true.
that's consistent with what the Germans taught me in Schule. They said that 90% of what Germans on Earth are blamed for were the actions of Jesuits.
Mhm.
And that if the people would actually pay attention to what other organizations those people were involved in, that they would find all of the perps were Jesuits first, and whatever else they were second.
Mhm. Mhm.
And every time I bring that up, I get told, "Well, you're just an advocate for the Germans." And I'm like, you know, you really need to know who the enemy is. And that was one thing that I found. I've already mentioned that I had this tutor from an Illuminati family, and when you go through their documents, you start finding this common thread of the Vatican is behind a lot of genocides throughout the entire world, including the doctrine of discovery, is what the horrors of colonialism were based on. And that was a Vatican papal order. So, we have that at the core of many of today's problems. And at least in the factions that I was involved in out there. Oh, that's terminology that my group uses. Here and now is here on Earth, real world, what everybody else sees out there is in the project. So, what we're seeing out there is that the entire economy is based on slavery. Completely. Everything. If they actually had to pay those people, it would bankrupt Earth.
Mhm.
All of the 30 plus trillion dollars that have been missing from the Pentagon funding in this century, all of it went for special access projects. All of it. And if they actually had to pay those operatives, it would bankrupt the country.
Right. That's one thing that Hunt mentioned, that the 50,000 ghosts that he knew about, if they got what they were owed plus damages, could potentially bankrupt the Treasury.
Oh, yeah. And then you have to look at the Exchange Stabilization Fund, that slush fund that the president gets access to. And it might even bankrupt that.
Well, I think they could work out some kind of, $1 million annuity paid, let's say, at 40,000 for 25 years, something like that, without bankrupting the country. And I think that that's what they should do. I think they should give an adequate, somewhat generous pension to those involved in off-planet activity and particularly dangerous activity both in space and on Earth, including time travel, for example. Now, obviously, those are two areas in which I served. I think there'd be other examples. But I'd like to see a sort of a 40-year pension, or let's say a 25-year pension at 40,000 a year, something like that. That we could afford, and that we should be considering. But I think we're spending money on doing things like finding second and third medications for certain diseases that have already been cured, and that can be reformed by changes in personal behavior that Big Pharma is pushing to sell another product. And there's been that sort of weaponization of medicine in a very negative way relative to overall equity in American society. There's been a lot of us, and I know I've been contacted by many people since I came forward publicly in 2004. I would estimate maybe about 1,000, maybe about 500 of which had culpable claims of talking about real service and special access programs. So it's a fairly large group of those of us in the baby boom.
I've done counseling with about 500 individuals, and I started in 2015. I came public in 2016, and I'd say 2/3 of them actually had some sort of service. The others watched too many videos and had dreams and assumed that meant they were part of us. That sounds...
There's a term for that Sasha Lessons shared with me, and I cannot remember it, but there's basically that psychiatric or psychological syndrome of somebody sees something very stimulating, whether it's a brilliant race down the slopes in the Olympic skiing events, or hears about somebody's service in space for the SSP, and they believe it happened to them. I think that's part of it. And so in that sense, I think we have to be circumspect about every claimant and explore what is the origin of their belief system. But I think it's all of the above. I think it's real experiencers. I think it's a mix of opportunists, a mix of delusional or fantasists, and maybe also a mix of government disinformants. And I think we have to listen and then just arrive at our own conclusions and share our thoughts with others about what somebody has claimed. I mean, people find, let's say, I don't know, I'll just use an example, Tony Rodriguez, very credible. I haven't read his book because I lost my vision before it was published.
Okay.
But
I haven't read his book because I've been working on my own, but I have known Tony since before he went public, and he and I have talked a lot over the years, and he did at one point distance himself from me whenever he was being involved with Gaia. And his core story is too real to be discounted.
That's what everybody I know who's read his book says, and I haven't read it. I did have about a 3-hour conversation with Tony, and one thing that struck me is that all of the data points of his memories are original. So it's not a case of somebody rehashing what's already been claimed.
Yeah.
That much I know after talking to him.
Yeah. His stories about his time in Seattle, he's been able to verify by visiting the place. His stories about his time in South America, the sites he describes are verifiable on Google Maps. As far as Ceres, what he says about Ceres makes perfect sense, and his time on Mars is consistent with what I know happened with slaves there, with the Germans. His description of German officers was so on point that I had to apologize to him because I was a German officer.
I felt many of the things we talked about had the ring of truth when I talked to him back in early 2021.
Yeah, that was when he was still working on his book, and
yeah,
he's been on my show a couple of times. We haven't talked a lot about his personal story because, To be honest, you get on these shows and they want your story 101 introductory version every time, and you just get bored with it.
I certainly know. I've done about 500.
Yeah, you get to where it's like, I really do not want to talk about that again. And when I hit that point, I was really rude to several people who were gracious and had me on their show, and I was like, I don't want to talk about that. I want to talk about this other thing. And some of them I would just, I'm going to talk about this, and you can just keep up if you can. And I look back on that and I'm like, oh my God, I was horrible. So, yeah. But you get to where you just don't want to talk about it anymore. And so when I've had him on, that was our understanding, was that we were going to talk about something else.
But I think at the same time, because everybody's going through the blogosphere, and even the mainstream media from different vectors, it usually is beneficial to share your information as much as possible, because there's so many people out there who still haven't heard all of our accounts. And it's a big country and a big world. And I've done a lot of media, and I'm still meeting people that have maybe heard me once, 5 years ago or 10 years ago. So I think it kind of helps to share information, because it takes something like 9 times of repetition for somebody to remember something or learn something. So.
Well, there's this man in Romania. His name is Daniel Sala. And he has spent thousands of hours going through every video I've ever done. And he's made a collection of the other topics that I've mentioned and the host didn't pick up on. And he's done like collages and put them together where they made sense, and he would have me watch them before he made them public to make sure that what he had me saying was actually what I meant to say, which I really respect that he's doing that. And his YouTube is Saint Olga 69. Now, anyone who knows the history of Eastern Europe, Saint Olga was the wife of a king, and he was murdered, and the village who did it, she went through and destroyed it. So she was really a powerhouse. So he chose somebody important to name his channel after. But I'm not recommending that anyone spend thousands of hours watching my stuff. But if you get in the mood
to... I think you have to agree, Penny, that the radio and podcasts have been serving the interests of the American people, whereas television is completely corrupt. It's clearly the fourth branch of government. It does nothing but lie and dissemble about any truth teller that agrees to be interviewed. I had such mistreatment and absolute breach of contract, defamation of character, and subversion of my truth by Matt Markovich at KOMO, which is the ABC affiliate in Seattle.
Mm.
I was interviewed by Vin DeBona of ABC Disney, and then my material was taken and used in Fringe, and then Markovich pointed to it and said I had been inspired by Fringe, which was like, okay, steal from the guy and then say he was inspired by it, by his own material. That's kind of hard to do. Of course, I knew I was doing a comedy when I did Weird or What involving William Shatner. Uh, he claimed my dad's name was Walter Basiago rather than Raymond Francis Basiago. That was kind of weird. Um,
Well,
and
Walter was
Jesse
the main.
Ventura gave that mealy-mouthed statement about me at the end of the episode of Conspiracy Theory that I did with Governor Ventura. That was
Yeah,
absolutely facetious.
I
And
was
dishonest.
surprised that he did the mealy mouth with you. Yeah, that really surprised me.
Well, it was scripted by Michael Braverman, and it was just absolute character assassination of a truth teller. And I can't believe that Governor Ventura, who positioned himself as, an independent and not working for the government, would do that. I think it actually indicated that Governor Ventura was working for the U.S. government when he attacked me in the same way that he attacked David Icke on conspiracy theory. It was completely contrary to what he had actually demonstrated with me and that I had demonstrated on his show. It was like getting up and, watching, I don't know, a crash at the Indianapolis 500 and then doing some mealy-mouthed speech at the end of the broadcast. Well, we didn't see a crash today in the Indy 500, thank God. It was a complete subversion of the truth. And Governor Ventura was complicit in that. So if anybody wants to study why I believe that television is the fourth branch of government and completely an instrumentality of the deep state, go no further than Governor Ventura's treatment of me on conspiracy theory.
Well,
I mean, we met with that
all you
woman.
have to do is look at William Colby's testimony to the church committee in 1975,
Absolutely.
where he said that when everything the public believes is a lie, we will have succeeded.
Right, what didn't Richard Helms say when he was DCI? That anybody of any import in television news is in our pocket?
Yes,
Something like that.
yes.
So there it
That's
is
the
right there. I mean,
gist of it.
television is used as a vehicle of disinformation. And as a contactee whose father worked on the ramjet to chase the ETs away from our planet beginning 70 years ago this year, 1952, I can vouch for the fact that this kind of paranormal caught on camera fixation of, oh, look, some lights in the sky, is disinformation per se.
The obsession with lights in the sky, most of which are American ships, just totally mortifies me. And yet that's what 90% of the disclosure movement is obsessed with. The other 10% is obsessed with debunking it.
The people are waiting for disclosure when they haven't even revealed to the American people after 70 years that the ETs were tracing certain industrial materials like gallium arsenide on the clothing of aerospace community workers like my dad and literally following them home so that they could contact or abduct their children to see if this questionable species that had rockets and nuclear weapons and was beginning to blow them up, destroying the physical substrates of the known universe,
Yeah.
was that was going on 70 years ago, and they're still obsessed with light in the sky.
Yeah.
I mean, even in 1967, 68, my dad and I saw this huge flying saucer above Morris Plains, New Jersey. It must have been at least 4 times the size of the Goodyear blimp. I've often mentioned that if that ship was size reference to the size of a Pelican, the 3 Chinook helicopters, multi-rotor helicopters that were trailing it, kind of monitoring it, would have been about the size of mosquitoes. It was huge. And when I said, "What is it, Dad?" he said, "I don't know, son, but I can tell you this. It wasn't developed by any country on this planet."
Yeah.
And so, we've had really dramatic contact cases and sightings that have been completely verified by multiple witnesses. And they're still focusing on these vague lights in the sky. I just consider it so ridiculous that the American people are allowing themselves to be lied to like this. And that's why I lauded the recent move by Richard Dolan, to acknowledge that one of the reasons for the post-war saucer flap, as it were,
Mm-hmm.
was our practice of blowing up nuclear weapons.
Oh, yeah.
That's been obvious since 1947 when, what was it? The nuclear plant in Tennessee, and drawing a blank on the name of it, and then
Oak
Hanford,
Ridge.
Washington. What was it again?
Oak Ridge.
Oak Ridge. Oak Ridge, Tennessee, Hanford, Washington, and Roswell, New Mexico. Those were the three most important nuclear locations on the American continent.
Mm-hmm.
And that was essentially the most significant cases of the 1947 flap of overflights.
Well, and
In the
then
case of
then
Roswell, that crash.
you still have, it was when Chernobyl happened, there was a saucer overhead that was seen to have shot it with lasers. You know, somebody out there is still angry that we're using nuclear power and nuclear weapons because we're affecting the substrate.
Now, is the implication of that, Penny, that Chernobyl was struck by an extraterrestrial craft?
Yes, it was. It was. That's documented. It was struck by an extraterrestrial craft. Witnesses saw laser beams coming out of the craft. I have a huge following in the former Soviet Union. No, I don't know why. But these folks have been supplying me with all kinds of information and official documents that I have to put through Google Translate to even know what they're sending me. And it's incredible, the information that's coming out of there.
I know Jacques Vallée was digging into those documents from the former Soviet Union, going back to the period right after the fall of the Berlin Wall.
Mm-hmm. Paul Stonehill is bringing forward a lot of Soviet documents about UFOs and USOs, the ones that are submersible underwater.
Mm-hmm.
And
now, Paul was a Soviet Russian, wasn't he, using a Western name?
I know he was a Soviet Russian. I don't know if he's American now or not. You know, we do nationalize folks. But I know that I have listened to way too many of his videos. And he comes up with some incredible stuff. And has documents for all of it. And I'm really impressed with his work. But every conference I've ever been to, the top named speaker is some kind of an agent. And I'm beginning to really get frustrated with that because so many of those agents are just spewing disinformation. And because they're the top name, that's who everybody listens to. And
right, and if you just point that out and offer evidence in support of such conclusions, what happens? As somebody in the truth movement, you're attacked for doing what?
Telling the truth.
Advancing the truth. So there are these epistemological complications, let us say, that we have to get past in the truth movement. And one of them is that telling the truth to falsehood is somehow an attack on the truth. No, it's an attack on falsehood, and it's a promotion of truth.
Well, I think that those of us who have served through the special access programs, not the public out there who's listening and judging and complaining all the time, but those of us who have actually been there, we understand that these agencies don't have our best interests at heart. And I've been especially sitting here going, why are we putting these agents at the top of the pile? Why are we treating them like they know more than we do? Why are we listening to the disinfo? Why are we sharing the disinfo? I mean,
Well, look at the fact that, Penny, I presented an intaglio of that second type of Martian humanoid, what I named Homo Martis Martis,
mhm.
or Mars man or woman on Mars. They're the little spindly ones that I believe were the ones that were there when Earthlings got there in antiquity. And of course, that group of Earthlings was cut off from us 11,500 years ago and has been breeding in isolation. So they're basically slightly different than us. Whereas there's that group of Homo Martis Terris, a name which means Earth man or woman on Mars, that are much closer to us. But then there's that smaller, spindly, sort of more elfin ones. The men look sort of like Marty Feldman. Some of them have antennae. But anyway, I had described that second type, as well as the first, for years, many years.
Yeah, I know
and
you
then
have.
my organization, the Mars Anomaly Research Society, found this stunning intaglio, one looking straight forward, and that was placed on the Coast to Coast AM website in August of 2013, already almost 10 years ago next August. And yet, a year or two ago, or even a year ago, they were releasing that picture, oh, a door on Mars. You know, there's always that flight to the de minimis, and people get excited about this schlock that they're being fed, and they don't realize that they're getting surrogate denatured information to hide the major truths of our universe.
That's exactly what's
My
happening.
example of that pattern. The intaglio that I published on Coast, which if it's not still up there, certainly it would be through the Wayback Machine, which I think was at what? Internet
Oh, yeah.
Archives.org or archives.org.
I find lots of things on the Wayback Machine. I have that bookmarked.
Right. So you can use that to go back to Coast. I think I was on sometime in the August 20s, like the 21st or 23rd or 26th, something like that.
Okay.
And it was a stunning image of a Martian. It wasn't of a Martian. It was clearly a drawing. It was artwork or artifact.
Okay.
But when you look at that, you've got to realize, how does it make sense to get all excited 8 years later about some possible door on the Martian surface when I've shown the door or the front of a Martian residence with this innate, or rather ornate, drawing or intaglio of some kind of a Martian humanoid? And I love the way that George Norrie played that, because it was kind of like, okay, people try to deny this. You know, so I think I really won the case of life on Mars when that was finally shown. At least the existence of very advanced ancient civilization there, if not current, at least that much. But the bottom line was that all of those amazing discoveries that Mars has done over the last 14 years since I published the discovery of life on Mars in December of 2008, it goes into like 25 or 35 people who have just published incredible stuff. And I found myself a couple weeks ago debating with Dr. Sala on his podcast of whether my work was actually pareidolia. Well, no. You know, the case for life on Mars has been proved. And not just I, but 34 other major Mars anomalists have done so, as well as confirmed, those of us who've been on the surface have confirmed things that have been shown in NASA's images. So we're so much
Dr.
beyond.
Sala does not even acknowledge that I exist, although he does use my term Nacht Waffen.
He uses your what?
My term Nacht Waffen for the
German
German fleet. I mean, everybody wants to call them Dark Fleet. If you're speaking German, why would you call yourself Dark Fleet? So I racked my brain and dug up what I remembered them calling their military, and I came forward with it in 2017 and in a interview, And we copyrighted it Creative Commons so that nobody could take it from the community. And I've been shocked by how many people use it and don't even acknowledge that I exist. It's
I
like,
think it's the title of Len Caston's book, wasn't it?
yeah,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah, you know, people are just taking it and using it and acting like I'm not even here. And it's like, wait a minute. You know, no, I'm not asking for money, but it would be nice to be recognized.
Yeah, I'd like to launch like an American integrity movement. Imagine how things would just clarify and be so much more real if
Yeah,
everyone just pledged themselves to personal integrity. That's what I think's missing.
yeah, we
But,
have somehow lost personal integrity. And I'm just like, okay, you use somebody's stuff, you mention their name.
right, we just circled again back to the German question. I want to ask you, or German subject in this field. I want to ask you, did you have any contact with Clark McClellan? Because
The name
I
sounds
think that
familiar.
I traced the first reporting about the German presence on Mars to McClellan. I was wondering if you had any contact with him.
I have not had any direct contact with him. When okay, my memories were activated by an NSA agent who sat on the Russian desk. His name was Stephen Wilhite, and he was a master sergeant in the Air Force, but he was an NSA translator. And in April 2013, we met, went to DC. He used the time frame. He kept repeating my code over and over and over and over and over. He obviously thought I was supposed to get instant recall. I did not. It was about a month later, it just went plop. This huge blob of memories that were all in German. And there were smells and tastes and feels and blood everywhere. And memories of being raped, memories of being every sexual crime that can be done to a toddler was done to me. And being nailed inside a wall and left to suffocate. And these were the kinds of things that were done to me at Langley. Now, I knew I was at Langley. And then I had the memories of the jump gate. And I had memories of being somewhere dirt colored, but mostly underground most of the time. And then flying a ship and critters. Critters that were not on Earth. So
Have you ever talked to Dr. Ralph Kennedy Johnston Sr. about his piloting of the sky taxi for the Americans?
no, I
On the
have
red
talked
planet?
to Ken Johnston, but he did not talk about Mars. So, uh, and I was Facebook friends, but never really talked to William Whitecrow. So, but at this point, I'm like, this is how I spent 2013 through 2015 was I had this big lump of these memories that were horrific, and all the talk was in German.
So how do we establish the nexus between the German connection and Langley? Do you think it could have been some kind of compartmentalization of different American personnel on the surface by like training, raising some with the German language and with this abusive framework that you described? Because I was I had some averse treatment when I was a child on Pegasus, but not anything more abusive than um, sort of getting memory suppressed after each trip to Mars. They were using what Major Dames described as the American reverse-engineered version of the Soviet Leda machine. You might ask Paul Stonehill or another former Soviet Russian that you know what Leda stands for, because I've never recovered it. It's capital Lida, some kind of acronym for a Russian phrase. But it basically was a helmet you put on that just subjected you to like 3 minutes of just absolutely diabolical sound and kind of memory wiped you. After, of course, we were debriefed.
I remember that helmet. I didn't know there was a name for it.
Mm-hmm.
So I do remember that helmet. But yeah, it was just, I had these horrific memories, and they were all in German, and I literally had to do research to know what I was remembering. So I've read all kinds of stuff, and the fact that it was in German and these were things that were not available on Earth led me to understand that I was in some sort of a Germanic space program. So that was the direction I took with my research. And I ended up with Michael Relf's information. I ended up with everything I could find from anybody. And a lot of it I discarded immediately as, pardon my cussing, but it was bullshit. And I would, if it was religious based, I would immediately toss it. But then I started looking back at some of the ancient stuff and the mythology, because I had a background with Velikovsky, and I know he's not popular, but it's okay. And so yeah, I did literally 3 years of research before I came public. So I can tell you who says what about what, because I did the research, I did the work. I can't give you a pure testimony because I had to do the work to know what I was remembering. And
well, I tracked White Crow down to his prepper compound outside of Reading.
Awesome.
And I actually stood up during the meeting in his garden with the late Ed Cherokee and the late William White Crow. They're both gone now, or at least supposedly they are. And I said, "You're my martial arts teacher in Pegasus." And then I ran into you on the surface of Mars, and you were smiling. And he said, "Yep." So White Crow knew for several years I was trying to find him through Ed Cherokee, but I didn't know the White Crow that he was referring to, that he wanted to introduce me to outside of Reading, was William Paris, which is how I knew him in Pegasus and possibly even on Mars. I think he might have already changed it to a shaman named William White Crow when we're on the surface of Mars. But that story that we told about he and I using AR-15s to knock down pterodactyls while we were protecting William Stilling since he didn't have a firearm, which Chris Hardwick made fun of on After Midnight, literally the husband of a Hearst, like Phoebe Hearst, like the great-granddaughter of William Randolph Hearst, was true. And that's, I think, the degree to which our common culture has been debased. The husband of a Hearst, and what were the Hearst journalism values? The curious, the interesting, the dramatic, and the bizarre. What could be more curious, interesting, dramatic, and bizarre than knocking down pterodactyls on the surface of Mars so they don't bite your and your two colleagues' heads off?
Yeah.
Here we had the husband of a Hearst making fun of us on After Midnight on Comedy Central.
Hearst's
fairly pathetic breakdown of American civilization.
Hearst and yellow journalism are irrevocably linked. So,
but I'm saying, even by the standards of yellow journalism, if he had reported to us as a yellow journalist, our story about fighting those pterodactyls on the surface of Mars met the 4 criteria of values of yellow journalism.
Absolutely.
The curious, the interesting, the dramatic, and the bizarre. And yet, instead, they did the Stephen Colbert and just ridiculed us when we, in fact, were brave American astronauts who had defended ourselves and our fellows at, at the threat of being killed on another planet. And I think that's just a measure of the degree of debasement of the American civilization by disinformation.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Television and the dumbing down of the school system have completely destroyed the ability of the average citizen to engage in critical thinking of any kind. And it's frustrating. I go on Facebook and I will make an intelligent post, and before I hit enter, I go back through and reword it down to 6th grade level.
mhm.
Otherwise, I get, huh? And
Right. The
it,
IQ has declined to an average of 100.
yeah,
Just about 20 years ago, it was 107.
yeah. And I get frustrated. Now, I know that President Reagan is the one who destroyed the public school system because he took out grammar, rhetoric, and logic. And those
Mhm.
are the basis of what's been called a classical education for 3,000 years. Grammar,
Mhm.
rhetoric, and logic. Without them, you are training people to be slaves. You are not training
Mhm.
them to live life as adult human beings. And I don't understand emotionally why we have allowed this. I understand intellectually why it's being done. It's because our generation, yours and mine, figured out that the government wasn't operating in our best interests, and we did a lot of things that undermined what they wanted to do, so they decided that they weren't going to have smart people anymore.
Mhm.
But why have we allowed it to go through? I mean, we could have changed it at any time. Take over the local school boards and just changed it.
Well, that's a good thought, a valid thought.
So we could still just take over the local school boards and demand grammar, rhetoric, and logic be taught again. When my sons hit high school and they all took geometry, I raised havoc with the teacher, with the school board, as to why they were no longer teaching two-column proofs in geometry, why they were not teaching logic in sophomore English and geometry. Uh, I was told that children that age were not capable of understanding logic, and yet I was 15 when I took it. I understood it just
Well, I mean,
fine.
Penny, they got rid of analogies on the SAT in the 90s. So they're literally saying a new generation of American kids couldn't figure out analogies. You know, it had been on there for, what, 50 years.
Yeah. Well, that explains why the local school that thinks children can't handle logic had 4 kids that got perfect scores on the SAT. Yeah. I'm one of those people. I expect that if my kid is going to school, they're going to learn a certain set of things. And if they're not learning that certain set of things, I cause problems for the people that are supposed to be teaching it.
Well, that's an interesting research question. I wonder who among SAP claimants can prove they were a National Merit Scholar. That'd be an
I
interesting
was.
correlative. I was too. Yeah, a National Merit finalist.
I was a
So,
National Merit finalist, and I had a full scholarship to go to Cornell University. And my father
mhm.
threw it away because he said girls need husbands, not degrees.
Mhm.
That was the
Yeah, Grinnell
particular
in Iowa. Yeah.
that was the particular wall that I kept hitting against. So he married me off to a preacher who beat me.
Mm.
But,
Sorry to hear that.
I'm here. I keep plugging along. I haven't died yet. I still make sense when I talk.
Everything is experience, and our spirits never die. So I
Yeah.
think we just have to write things off to experience and know that everything has a potentially formative and constructive purpose, ultimately.
Well, I'm watching a Supreme Court dominated by 6 Roman Catholics undo everything that guaranteed my personal rights since the 1980s. And everything that I have studied about history says that anything dominated by Roman Catholics is not good for the population.
Mhm.
So, sorry if that sounds judgmental to folks, but it is what it is.
Well, most Americans don't even know that Hitler and Himmler were Roman Catholics.
I know.
So
Hitler
we'll start right there.
Hitler replaced aristocracy in his organizations with Jesuits. And that was when things got really bad.
Yeah.
And that was one of the things that they talked about in Shula on Mars was they were looking at what mistakes were made. And their conclusion was that religion was behind warfare, hatred, most of the crimes on earth.
Well, religion means what? It means a linking back. That's why I've urged proteon, a linking forward. Why don't we use faith to create a better world? In the final analysis, we all die. So what's going to be left behind and what's going to be here for those in this situation matters more than what has happened in the past. So why not focus on proteon rather than religion? Anyway,
Well,
that might be a little bit too progressive for some people, but I think it's quite a logical surmise.
I think that makes perfect sense. I've been public for 2 reasons. One, William Cooper said that if you know they're going to kill you to hide in the spotlight, that at least.
Oh, yeah, that's what I call the reverse Danny Casolaro effect. If you have sensitive information and putting that of personal experience, share it. Don't hide it.
Yeah. So that's number one.
Protect yourself by sharing it.
And number two, I want these programs to have to shift from kidnapped children to consenting adults that get paid.
Absolutely.
That's why I'm public. So those two
Yes,
reasons.
it's a very important cause.
So anyone who has any ideas on how we can accomplish that, I would love to hear them. Now, we're getting close to our 2 hours that we agreed on. Are there any final comments that you wanted to leave the listeners with?
Not in particular. I do have an upswing of optimism about the fact that I think we're coming out of a period of national crisis, and I think that we should all commit ourselves to more of a sense that what's worth focusing on is what's forwarding. I think we've been stagnating as a common culture. And I would urge everybody to start thinking again about, for example, Abraham Lincoln's surmise that the best way to predict the future is to create it. So let's go about the business of doing so. And I salute you for working on that cause, as I hope I, in my better moments, would have been regarded as doing as well. I think that's very important. We've lost sight of that, and that we can recommit ourselves as individuals and as a common culture to doing just that, to predicting the future by creating it, focusing on better medical technologies to assist the disabled, to end certain disabilities. It's within our grasp, many, many worthwhile projects around the country are just not being funded. I've
Mm-hmm.
studied this because of my vision problems and my kidney problems, and we have to recommit ourselves to doing so. And I think it's within our grasp.
Regarding your kidney problems, I had a recent diagnosis scare and I did some research, and there is a mechanical kidney in animal testing, and it's looking really good. So you
Now,
might,
which one is that? Because I've studied all of
it
those developments. Are you talking about the hemofilter?
it's the one that they are installing it just upstream of your kidney, so they're not removing anything. Um,
Well, there's one that's going to be about the size of a small coffee cup called the hemofilter that's going to be placed near the pelvis that will literally be attached to the kidneys or the not the kidneys, but
the veins.
basically supplant the kidneys and be attached to the bladder. But that's according to Dr. Roy of Vanderbilt University, one of its two co-progenitors, the other being Dr. Frizzell of UC San Francisco. In a recent podcast on YouTube, actually it was September 30th, he stated that he's very optimistic that we are going to have such an artificial kidney, but not for about 10 years, which was a bit of a bummer to me as a dialysis patient.
I don't remember the name of it, but it was installed into the veins themselves just upstream of the kidney, and basically put a drain into the bladder. So it was in.
Well, you can look that up and report back to me. I'd really appreciate it, because I've been following the kidney project very closely, and it is optimistic. We're going to be having an artificial kidney, and it will do really everything that the kidney does except develop procrit. You'll have to get procrit injections to build hemoglobin, which is totally doable. That'd be like a couple shots a week in the tummy. They're rather short hypodermic needle, but that'll get people off dialysis, which is a huge money waster. It's now costing the American people about $3.3 trillion a year to treat the 3.3 million Americans on dialysis. About $1 million each a year, most of it through Medicare, about 80% from Medicare federally, and then 20% kick in on a state basis from Medicaid.
Mm-hmm.
We can get past that with the artificial kidney, but where it is right now is it's not getting the funding to get through clinical trials, FDA approval, manufacturing agreements, and manufacturing. So that's kind of where we're at with a lot of these amazing developments in what I call the bionic revolution. So that's something I think we should turn our focus to on the medical front, now that we're getting beyond the COVID-19 era. And we can do it. But I would love to know whether that is actually the hemofilter that you were becoming informed about.
Well, I'll look into that and let you know.
Yeah, if it's upstream from the kidneys, it might be another project, because the hemofilter.
This one was in animal testing, and I looked into it, and they wanted $30,000 to be included in the clinical trials on humans. So.
Well, maybe there's a lot going on. It may be another program that I haven't heard of. Because I know that the hemofilter was not upstream the kidneys. It was actually just down near the pelvis and very close to the bladder as a result. Now, there's also going to be an intermediary phase called the iHemo, which is going to be a miniaturized dialysis unit that people have a catheter in them just to be able to plug in at home. That'll be in advance, due in about 5 years. So if you could find out the name of that project, I would certainly welcome hearing it and looking that one up and educating myself on that development.
Okay. I'd be happy to do that. So.
We have to commit ourselves to telesis, right, which is progress intelligently planned.
Yes.
That was America, not panicking over pandemics
Not panicking over the new thing of the month every month.
Yes, but actually planning improvements and then implementing them.
That's what we used to do. Anyway,
Absolutely.
we are now at 2 hours. I would like to thank you very much for joining me. I've had a
Quite
wonderful
welcome.
time. If you're up to it, I'd love to have you back. Thank you,
Sure.
audience, for listening.
Thank you, Penny.